The bright studio lights beamed down on the stage, illuminating the set of one of the most watched news programs in the country. The audience sat in anticipation, some leaning forward in their seats, eager for a moment of controversy. The air carried a mix of excitement and tension. Everyone knew tonight's interview was going to be anything but ordinary. Seated gracefully in her chair was Melania Trump, poised and elegant as ever. Dressed in a sophisticated cream-colored suit, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of a woman who had faced countless criticisms yet never lost her composure. Across from her, sitting with a smirk playing on his lips, was Ethan Reynolds, a well-known liberal journalist notorious for his aggressive questioning. His reputation for tearing apart public figures was well established, and tonight, his target was clear. As the cameras rolled, Ethan leaned forward, his tone polished but laced with condescension. "Mrs. Trump, you've been accused of being distant, uninvolved, and nothing more than a silent figure in your husband's shadow. Many Americans wonder, what exactly is your purpose?" A murmur rippled through the audience. Some nodded, while others exchanged glances. This was it. The question meant to throw Melania off balance, to make her hesitate, to trap her into saying something that could be spun into headlines. But Melania didn't flinch. Instead, she offered a small, knowing smile before meeting Ethan's gaze with unwavering confidence. "Mr. Reynolds," she began in her soft yet firm accent, "it is always interesting to me how people speak with such certainty about my life when they know nothing of it." A hush fell over the audience. Ethan's smirk faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly, ready with his next attack. "Then perhaps you can enlighten us," he pressed. "Many argue that first ladies before you were far more active in policy-making and initiatives. Do you think you truly made an impact, or was your role merely symbolic?" Melania took a measured breath, her eyes scanning the room before answering. "Impact is not measured by how often you speak, but by the actions you take. I chose to focus on something meaningful, something beyond politics, helping children, advocating for their future, supporting causes that do not seek attention but need it. If that is not enough for you, then perhaps your idea of impact is different from mine." A wave of murmurs and nods spread across the audience. Ethan, sensing he was losing ground, leaned in further, his voice carrying an edge. "But surely you understand why people think you were simply a passive figure. You didn't challenge the administration, didn't voice strong political opinions. Some say you were complicit in everything that happened." For a brief moment, silence filled the air. The tension was thick. Everyone waited to see how Melania would react. She tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. Then, with a composed yet piercing gaze, she replied, "Mr. Reynolds, I did not marry a politician. I married a man, a husband, a father. My role was never to argue for power or to seek attention. My role was to support my family, to stand by my son, and to serve where I could. Is that not what every mother, every wife, every human being strives to do?" The audience collectively exhaled, some even breaking into quiet applause. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time, he hesitated. He had expected defensiveness, maybe even irritation, but what he received was calm reasoning wrapped in undeniable truth. His carefully laid out attack was crumbling. Trying to regain control, he threw out another question. "So, you're saying you have no regrets? No moments where you wished you had done things differently?" Melania's smile returned, softer this time. "Regrets come from those who act without thought. I have always been thoughtful in my choices, and I stand by them. If you believe a person must be loud to be strong, then perhaps you misunderstand what true strength looks like." This time, the audience did applaud. The journalist, momentarily speechless, shifted in his seat. He glanced at his notes, as if searching for a new angle, but he knew. He had lost control of the interview. Melania Trump had not only held her ground, but she had turned the entire moment in her favor. The audience wasn't mocking her anymore. They were admiring her. As the segment neared its end, Ethan gave a polite but forced smile. "Well, Mrs. Trump, I must say, that was an unexpected response." Melania simply nodded. "I believe the truth often is." The camera zoomed out. The producer signaled the end of the interview, and the audience gave a final round of applause. Ethan sat back, his face unreadable, but inside he knew. He had tried to embarrass Melania Trump on live television, and instead, she had left him speechless. The applause from the audience still echoed through the studio as the cameras cut to a commercial break. Ethan Reynolds sat stiffly in his chair, the practiced ease of his usual interviews now slightly shaken. He had expected to control the narrative, to corner Melania Trump into giving a hesitant or defensive response. Instead, she had completely flipped the situation, answering his questions with a calm confidence that had won over the audience. Behind the scenes, the producer scrambled. The control room was buzzing with voices, some amazed, others frustrated. They had been banking on a viral moment, a slip-up from Melania that could dominate the news cycle for days. Instead, the opposite had happened. Ethan's earpiece crackled. "We need to regain control of the narrative. Push harder. Make her uncomfortable," the voice from the control room instructed. He took a deep breath and adjusted his tie. As the cameras went live again, he leaned forward, his expression carefully composed, masking his irritation. "Mrs. Trump," he said smoothly, "your words just now have certainly surprised many. But let's address something more pressing. Your silence during major controversies. Many argue that it was harmful. You were married to one of the most controversial presidents in modern history, and yet you rarely spoke out. Can you really say you were not complicit?" Melania remained composed. She adjusted her blazer slightly, letting a pause linger just long enough to create tension before responding. "Mr. Reynolds," she began, her voice steady, "there's a difference between silence and dignity. I spoke when it was necessary. I worked behind the scenes. Just because my actions were not made into headlines does not mean they did not exist." Ethan smirked, sensing an opening. Behind the scenes? But the public saw very little. No major political statements. No strong positions. Many believe that a first lady should take a more active role in shaping the country. Would you say you failed in that responsibility? A murmur rippled through the audience. It was a sharp question, designed to corner her, to force a moment of doubt. But Melania was unfazed. "I find it interesting," she said, tilting her head slightly, "how expectations change depending on who is being questioned. Were other first ladies also asked to challenge their husbands in public? Were they expected to play a role in policies they had no hand in creating?" The question caught Ethan off guard. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, a moment barely noticeable but enough for the audience to catch. Melania leaned slightly forward, her gaze steady. "A woman is not strong because she argues loudly on television. A woman is strong when she holds her values, regardless of pressure. I focus on children, on kindness, on the things that truly make a difference. If your definition of strength is being part of political fights, then perhaps it is your definition that is weak." The audience erupted into applause, louder this time. Even those who had started the interview skeptical now nodded in admiration. Ethan forced a small chuckle, but there was nervousness behind his polished smile. He could feel the energy in the room shifting against him. He needed to regain control, and fast. He glanced at his notes. Time for the personal attack. "Mrs. Trump," he said, "let's talk about your past. You faced accusations about your background, your career choices before politics, and even your qualifications to be First Lady. Do you believe you were ever truly fit for the role?" The audience gasped slightly. This was a direct jab, a clear attempt to undermine her personal integrity. Melania's expression remained unreadable for a moment. Then she smiled, not a forced, nervous smile, but one of quiet amusement. "My past," she echoed. "Mr. Reynolds, I came to this country with a dream, like many before me. I worked hard. I built a life. And I stood in the White House not because of privilege, but because I earned my place." The room fell silent. Even Ethan seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Melania continued, her voice unwavering. Is it not the American dream to rise beyond expectations? To prove people wrong? Or is the American dream only for some and not for others? The journalist opened his mouth to counter, but before he could, someone in the audience stood up and clapped. Then another, and another. Soon, the entire audience was on their feet. The studio cameras captured everything. The standing ovation, the look of defeat on Ethan's face, and Melania's quiet, confident smile. Ethan knew it was over. The control room knew it was over. They had set up this interview to tear her down. Instead, she had walked away stronger than ever. As the cameras cut, Ethan turned to her, his voice lower. "I'll admit," he said, forcing a chuckle, "I didn't expect that." Melania simply extended a hand. "Perhaps next time, Mr. Reynolds, you will expect more." And with that, she walked off stage, leaving behind the journalist, the cameras, and the stunned silence of a media world that had underestimated her. The standing ovation was still in progress as Melania Trump gracefully exited the stage. The studio remained charged with an energy that even the control room hadn't anticipated. Ethan Reynolds sat motionless for a moment, staring blankly at his notes. This was supposed to be his moment, the interview that would dominate headlines, proving once and for all that Melania Trump was an unworthy, passive figure. Instead, the opposite had happened. She had won. The cameras cut to commercial break, and Ethan immediately removed his earpiece, frustrated murmurs filling the air as his producers bombarded him with suggestions. They wanted damage control, but he already knew there was no saving this. Within hours, clips of Melania's poised responses flooded the internet. Her statement, "Is the American dream only for some and not for others?" was already being quoted across social media, turning into a viral trend. On conservative platforms, she was hailed as a symbol of grace and resilience. Even some neutral commentators admitted that her composure and reasoning had dismantled every attack thrown at her. But the backlash was fierce. Liberal media outlets scrambled to spin the situation. Some claimed Ethan's questioning had been unfairly criticized, while others tried to downplay Melania's responses. But the damage was already done. The people had seen the exchange firsthand. The next morning, Melania's name was on every major news outlet. Some headlines were supportive. "Melania Trump shuts down critics with one perfect response." A newfound respect? How Melania Trump just redefined her legacy. Others were desperate to regain control. Melania's carefully rehearsed answers. Was this all staged? Did she really win? A closer look at the viral interview. Regardless of the angle, one thing was clear. People were talking about her, and for the first time, not as a silent figure, but as a woman who had taken control of her own narrative. Inside the Trump residence, Melania sat by the large window, sipping her morning tea as she scrolled through the endless coverage. She had been in the public eye for years, but something about today felt different. There was no pity in the way people spoke of her, no empty speculation about her silence. For the first time, there was an acknowledgement of her own strength. Barron walked into the room, holding up his phone with a smirk. "Mom, you're trending everywhere. Even some of your biggest critics are admitting you handled that interview better than they expected." She looked up, amusement flickering in her eyes. "Did they think I would run away?" Barron chuckled, shaking his head. "They underestimated you, but they won't make that mistake again." The door opened, and Donald Trump walked in, phone in hand, a proud grin stretching across his face. "Well, Melania, I gotta say, you really made them eat their words. I've been watching the reactions all morning." Melania set down her teacup and met his gaze. "It was never about proving them wrong," she said calmly. "It was about showing them who I really am." Donald nodded, his expression shifting into something more thoughtful. "And you did better than anyone could have imagined." She glanced at the television, where yet another replay of the interview was being broadcast. The moment when she had turned the tables on Ethan Reynolds. The moment the audience had begun to see her differently. For years, people had tried to define her, to put her in a box, to dismiss her as just another political wife standing in the background. But now, the world had seen her for what she truly was, and there was no going back. The interview had started as an attempt to embarrass her, but instead, it had made her stronger. Melania Trump had spoken, and the world had no choice but to listen.